Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite you to connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, my name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We'll be dedicating some time towards the end of the conversation to respond to those questions. The webinar is also being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to that recording, as well as any resources and slides used during the conversation, will be shared in a follow-up email to all who registered for the session. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And lastly, I just want to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week on April 11th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a Crucible of Practice Salon on how a community coalition mobilized for early school success. At 3 p.m. that day, we have a session co-sponsored with the Overdeck Family Foundation, Beyond the ESSER Funding Cliff, Local Supports to Sustain High-Impact Tutoring. Then on the 18th, please join us for a funder-to-funder conversation focused on kindergarten as a critical time and place for investment to ensure long-term school success. We'll be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for these upcoming learning and engagement opportunities. And finally, I lied, one more thing. I just want to take a minute to share that we are inviting everyone to participate in this year's What's Working Exchange. We're gathering information about nationwide efforts related to a few strategies which support learning loss recovery. The question form is easy to complete and takes around 5 to 8 minutes. Your responses will be used to connect communities with one another and deepen our impact in early literacy for children. We'll post a link to that question form in the chat and invite you to pull that up to complete as soon as the webinar finishes. Joining you now is Emily Samos, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to each and every one of you. And thank you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, State Investments Taking High Impact Tutoring to Scale. Today, we will once again continue our series following on to our session from late last year, when we took some time to follow the money and understand how states and districts are investing the $190 billion that was included in the federal recovery dollars known as the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER. As many of you have heard me say before, each month we're engaging in deep explorations of what we are calling smart investments, or strategies that we see as worthy big bets that have the potential to make a real impact on equitable learning recovery if invested and implemented now and sustained even beyond the current influx of federal support. And for our important discussion today, we are very happy to be partnering again with Overdeck Family Foundation to begin a two-part series this week and next week focused on high impact tutoring. We have the opportunity to learn from incredible national and state tutoring leaders who are partnering with districts to expand and scale their evidence-based programs to reach more students needing this important intervention to accelerate their learning and catch up. We will explore what states are doing and can do through policymaking, funding support, and other strategies to create the enabling conditions necessary for high impact tutoring programs to reach their full potential. We will delve into research that is already demonstrating how much of a difference this high quality and high impact tutoring can make for students, for young students and what it takes to make programs successful for both tutors, for students, for school districts, for tutoring providers, for families. And we will discuss how programs are recruiting and training tutors to deliver the particular interventions that research shows are most effective, while again lifting up the efforts of the U.S. Department of Education to deploy hundreds of thousands of caring adults through the National Partnership for Student Success. We have an extremely robust conversation ahead of us, and I'm excited to introduce our esteemed moderator, who will then introduce our panelists and get us going. And I just want to make a quick note that full bios are linked in the chat, so we will just be previewing who we have with us today. So our moderator today is Pete Laverini, and he leads the Innovative Schools portfolio at Overdeck Family Foundation, which aims to expand access to tech-enabled, student-centered K-9 learning environments. As a former 6th grade teacher, Pete believes that every child deserves an education that both empowers and connects. So Pete, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Emily. I am really excited to be here today to talk about the incredible potential that high-impact tutoring has for millions of students nationwide. It's clear that student growth and achievement in both literacy and math decreased during the pandemic from already unacceptably low levels. The pandemic widened pre-existing opportunity and achievement gaps, disproportionately impacting students from communities that have been historically disadvantaged. Like our partners at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, Overdeck Family Foundation believes that improving children's opportunities to learn is the key to unlocking a better future. With that lens, the Innovative Schools portfolio that I lead is investing in high-dosage, small group tutoring as an effective strategy for boosting student learning and increasing student engagement. We're not alone, as education leaders across the country are increasingly turning to tutoring to help provide students with the personalized support that they need and that they deserve. This is a critical time for educators and administrators at all levels of our education system to gain a deeper understanding of what it will take to ensure that high-impact tutoring reaches the students that need it, is effectively implemented, and importantly, can be sustained into the future. As Emily mentioned, today's conversation will focus on what state leaders can do to create the enabling conditions for tutoring to thrive. And that brings me to today's conversation and our esteemed panel of research, policy, and nonprofit leaders. It's my honor to introduce today's panel. So first, Sharon Contreras, who is the CEO of the Innovation Project in North Carolina, a collaborative of school districts committed to high academic achievement and equity through innovation. Dr. Contreras has held 2 superintendencies, including Guilford County, North Carolina, and is celebrated for implementing policies and practices aimed at improving student life outcomes. AJ Gutierrez is the co-founder, vice chair, and chief of marketing and communications at Saga Education. Prior to this, they were with Saga Innovations, Summer Search, and Match Education. AJ has also served as a core member with City Year and as a service project coordinator with the College Orientation Workshop. Kevin Huffman is the founding CEO of Accelerate, a national initiative that seeks to embed high-impact tutoring and personalized learning in public schools. Kevin is the former Tennessee Commissioner of Education, where he managed the State Department of Education in its efforts to advance the academic progress of nearly 1 million students. And Carly Robinson is a senior researcher at the Stanford Graduate School of Education and the director of research at the National Student Support Accelerator. Her research interests sit at the intersection of education, psychology, and policy. So clearly, tutoring is at the top of mind for everyone right now, including the folks on this call. But we know that tutoring as a tool to support student learning definitely isn't a new idea. It's been around for decades. So I want to start this conversation with you, Sharon. You were just recently leading a large school district. What role did high-impact tutoring play for you at Guilford County Schools? And what was different about the tutoring efforts that you led there compared to the types of tutoring our audience may have seen in the past?
Thank you for the question. And also thank you for this conversation today. You know, this seems like so long ago when the pandemic started, but I remember very distinctly the week the governor closed schools. And at first we thought this will be a few days, but after about a week, we realized we're going to be out of school for some time. And I remember feeling a great sense of anxiety and angst because we quickly learned that many students and families had no devices and were sharing devices, and the district only had one device per 17 students, and many families had no access to broadband connectivity. In fact, when they were calling the cable companies and others to try to get connectivity, they were being told exorbitant prices, like it will cost $23,000 to connect in your neighborhood. So we started thinking about, what do we do? Because these students are going to fall behind. We knew they were going to be out of school a long time, and we realized we needed to set up some structures right away. So the first thing we did, in addition to trying to get devices and working on the broadband connectivity with many other people across the state and the country, was call the universities and start working on getting college students who were home. They were sitting home at that point, to try to arrange for college students to assist us with tutoring. We also started working to get graduate assistants. And once ESSER funds came in, we literally paid for the graduate assistantships. So we paid their tuition, we paid for the assistantships, and that 20 hours they worked each week was paid directly for 20 hours of tutoring to GCS students. We worked with retired teachers, and then we started working or paying our own AP and IB students to tutor their peers. We developed a unit within the district to support students. And, many people ask the exact question that you just asked me. So what's the difference? Because if you've worked for years, and I've worked in this field for over 3 decades, we know that in Title I schools in particular, we've always provided tutoring. There's much of the money has gone to tutoring, and people say, so what's different about this? I think the difference has been we finally put structures and guardrails around this and realize there's evidence base about the way in which you tutor to get results. And so we actually assign tutors to students. We realize and use the research about what works in tutoring and assigning students to specific tutors and for a certain amount of time, and trying to do the tutoring during the school day. And I won't say that when we first started, we failed, but the tutoring model evolved based on what we learned. And when you just invite students to show up, which is the old model of tutoring, if you need tutoring, show up from 3 to 4 o'clock after school. Some students did, but many students work. Many students just face peer pressure or whatever, not to show up for that tutoring block. But when you build it into the school day, when you have a unit at the school system that is dedicated to working with families and partnering with the parents and the students to check in and make sure that students are actually engaged in the tutoring, when you have data systems that are measuring the effectiveness of the tutoring, I think you get a much bigger bang for your result. And we did see and are seeing results in Guilford County as a result of that. And I'm so glad that the current superintendent, who was the deputy superintendent at the time, is continuing that work and has even improved upon the model.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Dr. Contreras. I think I love starting the conversation with you so that you could bring to light the urgency that you saw for your students and how high impact tutoring can play a role in that. And I want to build off what you mentioned, which is the idea of structure and research, and invite Carly into the conversation here. So Carly, Dr. Contreras highlighted how there have been and continue to be many different approaches to tutoring that are taking place in and out of schools. From your perspective as a researcher, can we just start by defining high impact tutoring? What are the essential elements that a program has to have to be considered high impact? And why are those components important?
Yes, thanks, Pete. This is I think it's really important we define what we mean when we are talking about tutoring. Because like Dr. Contreras said, like tutoring has been happening for many years. This is not a new idea, but it's really the guardrails around it that I think are changing and that matter a lot. And so as a researcher, where I'm coming from is that there's a rigorous body of research showing that tutoring is a really effective way to accelerate learning, especially for struggling students, which is why we're all here talking about it at a time when people want answers to how to best support as many children as possible. But it's really important to understand that there are different approaches and models of tutoring, and not all of these approaches are effective or equitable. And so the tutoring programs that are represented in the research base and that have been proven to work over time tend to share several key elements, which we believe contribute to tutoring being high impact. So what are they? High impact tutoring involves students receiving one-on-one or small group instruction from a consistent, well-trained tutor. And students are meeting with this tutor 3 or more times per week for a developmentally appropriate amount of time. And tutors are using high quality curriculum that supplements what the student is learning in school while also using data to track student progress and inform instruction. And I feel like what Dr. Contreras described is like exactly this on the ground. But we really found that it's helpful not only to describe what we understand to be the elements of high impact tutoring, but also to hone in on what it is and what it is not. And so again, what this information is based on is, like I said, a large body of rigorous research available to date. And I'm sure this will evolve as we learn more about tutoring effectiveness and how to scale it. But based on what the research tells us today, high impact tutoring is not a regular homework help. It's consistent instruction that develops a strong relationship between the student and the tutor that increases well-being, as well as content-specific learning. It provides a consistent tutor, not a different tutor each session. And so this consistency is important as it builds relationships so that sessions are not just focused on question resolution. And sessions are really built around students' needs as informed by data. So they're not just reliant on the student to identify what they need. And high impact tutoring is focused on acceleration so that students can build the specific skills they need for grade level work. So it's not just focused on remediation. And importantly, it's intensive, it's not ad hoc with regular meetings several times per week. And this instruction is synchronous, but it can be either in person or virtual. It's not just asynchronous or on demand where students are logging on as they need help. And finally, I think this is really key. It's accessible to all students in need. And as a result, it doesn't rely on parents to take it up or pay for the tutoring. So it's really embedded into the students' learning experience in school. So I would say that high impact tutoring is relatively straightforward and based on a large body of research, yet as we're seeing, implementing it can be tricky, which is, I think why we're all here today.
Carly, thank you so much for just helping us ground this conversation on what we actually are talking about when we say high impact tutoring. One thing that you didn't mention, or at least go into too much detail, but I think is probably a question that many folks on this call have, I certainly do, which is how should we be thinking about the elements of high impact tutoring when considering it being in person or delivered virtually or online?
Yes, we get this question a lot as to whether virtual tutoring can be as effective as in-person tutoring. And I wouldn't say that this is a settled question yet. My team is currently trying to formally research this, but there is reason to be optimistic about the potential for virtual tutoring to meaningfully impact student learning. First, there's some recent studies that suggest virtual tutoring can be effective, and I'll imagine we'll be learning a lot more about this in the coming years. And I will get a little bit more into what I think virtual high impact tutoring looks like. But first, I want to make a key distinction, and that is that a lot of states and districts are offering students free opt-in tutoring or on-demand tutoring where they can access a tutor virtually whenever they want. Often this is called virtual on-demand tutoring. And I think this can be a really beneficial resource. However, this is not what we would consider high impact tutoring. Students, in most of these cases, students are not meeting with consistent tutors. The sessions are not frequent or embedded into the school experience, and students have to bring their own questions to the tutor. There isn't really a set curriculum to follow. And we actually studied one of these programs and found that less than 20% of students ever once logged on to access a tutor. And the students who were struggling academically were half as likely to log on than their higher achieving peers to actually go on and get help from a tutor. So it's not reaching the students that really need the help. So what we think is really key here is that for virtual tutoring, to be based on the research and see results, it really needs to have all their elements of high impact tutoring. So that means that students have a consistent tutor who they're meeting with, ideally in school multiple times per week, and the tutors are well trained and have a quality curriculum that they are following and tracking student progress with data. So I would say that I'm very optimistic that high impact tutoring can be delivered virtually and effectively, but like all educational interventions, how the program is designed and implemented matters a lot.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing in that important nuance to this conversation. And last question for you before we turn to some other panelists. And so we know that everybody is really excited about high impact tutoring, but we also know that some states and districts are struggling at this point to ensure that all students who need it get access to it. What can you tell us about the conditions that you and the other folks at NSSA have identified that are most necessary for high impact tutoring to reach the students that will benefit most from it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I like I said, tutoring has this rigorous research base. We're really excited about it. However, just identifying an evidence-based intervention is the first step. Whether the intervention actually improves outcomes depends on whether the conditions and supports are in place to make that intervention successful. So if we're talking about the state level, there are certainly some enabling conditions that, if present, will make it more likely that the students who need the most help will actually receive high impact tutoring and benefit from it. And so we think of these conditions as falling under three buckets: legislation, resources, and infrastructure. And I would say probably no surprises here, funding. So first, I'll just give some examples of each of these. First, on the legislative front, has the state passed legislation that requires districts to implement tutoring for specific groups of students in ways that align with the elements of high impact tutoring? These are kind of like the guardrails that we were talking about earlier. And so places like Texas, Tennessee, and Washington, D.C. have done this, albeit in very different ways. And we have seen that these types of mandates can really drive districts to implement tutoring programs that try to reach struggling students. But I will say that without infrastructure funding, they're not necessarily going to be successful. Second, states can provide resources and infrastructure related to high impact tutoring. So some examples of what this might look like are, states can have a vetted list of tutoring providers for districts to pull from, or they might provide training and playbooks for districts who want to set up high impact tutoring programs. Although we have seen that when districts have to opt into accessing these resources, it tends to be the better resource districts who have the capacity to engage with optional trainings that actually take them up. And we also see that states can support districts on the staffing front. States like North Carolina, Colorado, others are investing in recruiting and tutoring core. And then third, I would say states can provide districts with funding support for implementing high impact tutoring. We're seeing states promise money for these types of programs, even now going on beyond ESSER funding, which makes investing or getting tutoring programs up and running much more attractive to districts. And some states have also provided grant opportunities to universities who are creating their own tutoring programs and sourcing undergraduate and graduate students, like Dr. Contreras mentioned in Guilford County, as tutors to tutor in districts across the state. And I just want to note, not all in the funding case, but in all of these examples, not all funding is made equal, or not all resources are made equal. Some states have chosen to give money directly to families, like $500 or $1,000 to spend on tutoring for their children, which I think sounds really great. But we're found that there's really low take up among families. And like the data on on-demand tutoring I shared before, it's even less likely that students who are at risk or struggling receive the tutoring that these states are investing the money in because they want those students to receive the tutoring. So I would say, just to sum up, strategic approaches to providing accountability, support, and money at the state level can really set districts up for success, but they need to work in tandem and be well thought out.
Love that. That's absolutely phenomenal. I'm gonna thank you so much, Carly. I'm gonna turn now and bring in H.A. Gutierrez to provide a deeper look at the role that states can play in bringing about the conditions that you just talked about. So first, AJ, for those who may not be familiar with Saga, can you tell us about the organization and how you partner with schools, districts, and states to accelerate student outcomes?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So Saga Education, we were a central driving force in the high impact tutoring movement. Out of the scientific literature on high impact tutoring, the body of research that was conducted on Saga by the University of Chicago Education Lab is the largest, has demonstrated strong academic outcomes for students. It is among the few that are actually peer reviewed. COVID-19, amplified the need for new types of evidence-based instructional supports for students. And at Saga, we recognize that it wouldn't be possible for us to directly support all the students who could benefit from our high impact, high dosage tutoring model. So as a result, we created a new pathway for scaling on our impact, which focuses on empowering states and districts to implement high impact tutoring on their own. And so in a world beyond ESSER, to us, this is the most sustainable and scalable strategy, right? Making high impact tutoring a central part of K-12 design at critical growth years for students, which has historically been early literacy and late math. So with that said, we are actively building a community of practice with district leaders, sharing everything we know about effective high impact tutoring, including our resources, our technologies, our tools, and providing technical assistance with things like recruitment and selection, training of the tutors, training the managers of their tutors, data and assessments, et cetera, et cetera. Right now we have partnerships. We have state level partnerships like the state of Oklahoma, the state of New Mexico, the state of Maryland. And in addition to those state partnerships, we also work alongside districts, such as Chicago Public Schools, which is actively implementing high impact tutoring in over 200 schools within the district.
That's phenomenal. And we at Overdeck are so excited to be supporting you and the whole entire soccer team to do the work that you're doing. So you mentioned, AJ, that you support a number of different states for this work. I wonder if you can talk to us a bit about what conditions at the state level that you see as the most important to ensure that high impact tutoring programs can succeed. And if possible, could you give us some examples of those conditions?
Right, that's a good question. In general, my suggestions fall into two categories, policy and implementation. On the policy side, we have a number of recommendations, but I will only share two because I promised you, Pete, I will keep it tight. The first one is voluntary guidance on key tenets of high impact tutoring that's grounded in solid evidence. So no one likes to be told what to do. And so I think if policymakers frame high impact tutoring, hey, these guardrails, we highly encourage you to follow them. But if you don't, you can go outside of these parameters. But if you do, districts should be encouraged to continue to research whatever changes they make to see if in fact it was a good idea to help lift the field. And this is important because if you look at New York, for example, I know the governor wanted to steer $250 million to support high impact tutoring throughout the state. And it was framed more of a mandate. So when it met state policymakers in the state, they immediately said no, precisely for the reason I mentioned to you, because they don't want to be told what to do. However, if you have a more practical approach for scaling evidence-based programs, giving that flexibility, I think you're more likely to get a goodwill from district leaders. The second piece on the policy front includes creating intentional pathways into teaching. So if you look at high impact tutoring as a mechanism where you can cultivate and nurture the next generation of highly qualified teachers, you not only you have this dual value add now, not just looking at tutoring as a way to accelerate learning, but as a way to cultivate new talent within the district. So those are two things on the policy front. Now, on the implementation side of things, there are four things that I want to share. The first thing is for a state leader or a district leader, it's important to hire a district or school-based staff that will support the rollout of this work and also implementation. The second thing I will mention is that you should go think about going small before you go big. So if you implement small pilots, roll it out with people who are very excited about this, early adopters, you can work out some of the challenges and think about what this really looks like in your context before you think about scale within your district. The third thing is focusing on high leverage areas, which is third grade literacy and ninth grade algebra 1. You don't have to provide a tutor to every single student in every subject. Just focus on those high leverage points as you think about what scale could look like within your district. And the last thing is, once you get beyond, program design and logistics, if I had to pick a secret sauce for high impact tutoring, it is having a robust plan around training and ongoing professional development for tutors. And this is something many folks have overlooked, not everyone, but this is important for ensuring, especially rookie educators, so that they have the skills and information they need to use high quality instructional materials to align with classroom instruction. And if you don't have that in place, tutors don't feel supported, teachers don't feel supported, students don't feel supported. So with this in mind, one of the things we have done at Saga, we've made our math tutoring curriculum available for free. So you can go on our website and use the content we've developed over 17 years that makes sense in a tutorial context as standards aligned. So that's free to use. We also stood up a self-guided training portal on components of effective tutoring that is relevant, that it could be supportive regardless of your subject or grade. So we highly encourage everyone to take a look at that and use that resource as well.
That's great, AJ. Love the seeing a lot of connections between you just mentioned about those elements of effective tutoring and what Carly mentioned. I'm sure we're going to learn even more about that from Kevin and Sharon in just a bit. But I want to just focus a bit on the fact that you're a provider. Like Saga is a partner to a number of these states, and say it takes two to tango, maybe more. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about how, as a provider, what an ideal state partnership looks like for you. So what's it, and what does it look like for not just the state, but maybe an ideal partnership with district and school partners as well?
Yeah, I think the one thing that stands out for Saga is that, again, this is a message of empowerment. We really think that districts and states can do this on their own and do so very effectively. I mean, you're expert educators. Why should tutoring exist outside the ecosystem of K-12 education? It's just illogical to me. But setting that aside, I think what's important is that we work alongside districts and states that believe that this should be part of the fabric of how they operate. I think the other thing is recognizing that there's no simple solution for mitigating against the effects of COVID-19. And so if a state sees high impact tutoring as part of the portfolio of things they want to do to support students, those are the kind of partnerships we're looking for. A good example is what's happening in the state of Tennessee, where they recognize students need all kinds of resources right now, and just high impact tutoring is just part of a comprehensive approach that they're taking to supporting families and students right now with really encouraging results. The other thing that is important for a state partnership is that I highly discourage against mandates. So if the state says, look, this is an important part of our strategy, what you can do is create incentives and have briefings and convenings where you could talk to district leaders about this and allow districts to opt into it. So you can get people who really see this as being part of their strategy. And for the districts who opt into it, then you can provide the resources and technical assistance on things like scheduling and strategy. That type of structure, getting buy-in, it's an important part of the partnership. And then, with those early adopters, you can get a sense of what effective implementation looks like in your context, and then create the conditions where you can think about what that looks like at a larger scale within your community.
That's great. I and I hope our audience is hearing from all three of our panelists so far today, a learning mentality, right? Even though we know that high impact tutoring can be really powerful when it has the elements of name, when we're doing the work of making sure students have access to it and it is as effective as possible, having a true learning mentality is really necessary for this work to take off. All right, so with that, I want to turn now to Kevin Huffman. So Kevin, Accelerate for the past year and change, right? Just over a year or so, has really been leading the charge to integrate tutoring into public schools in the US, funding promising practices and building the evidence base to more deeply understand tutoring's impact. Can you talk more about Accelerate's mission and in particular how your team works with district and state leaders?
Yeah, thanks, Pete, and thanks to everybody for coming. It's a great group to be with. So we're very focused on scale, and we're focused on the question of how do you take this thing that has so much promise and potential, but to date has existed at a relatively small scale in states and districts, even with a lot of support. And we're trying to figure out how do you scale free high impact tutoring in public schools across the country. And there are a few areas where we think we can be helpful. So one is funding and supporting innovation, looking for new ideas and new projects that are smaller scale that have a lot of potential, and helping them to get a little bit of resources and also to start to build the research and evidence base that they'll need to scale. Second is supporting and funding high-end research that will allow us to learn more about the things that do and don't work, so that over time, as we're scaling things, we're scaling the right things. And so we have a large-scale project with the University of Chicago Education Lab, looking at a variety of factors in tutoring delivery, including hybrid models of delivery. We have worked with NSSA and provided funding to Brown and to Stanford for a number of their studies, which are looking at a lot of really important questions about what works. And we're working with some other universities as well. But the goal is to figure out what works as people are attempting to scale it. And then the third major area is policy, and in particular, state policy, and trying to figure out how do we build policies that are conducive to growing the best programs and projects. And you've heard a little bit about that from some of my colleagues on the panel. So one way that we're working with states right now, we have a state grant program that we released for applications a couple of months ago and will announce the winners of in the next couple of weeks. But we're attempting to identify a group of leading light states that want to work together to build model policy agendas, and then help each other in a cohort to identify ways of growing via the state level high impact tutoring. We think if we can figure out how to replicate some of the great work that's happened in other sectors in education, like high quality instructional materials, where states have come together and tried to help develop the kinds of policies and practices that build out a sector, that could be really helpful. So we're doing that with states, and we'll announce grant winners in a couple of weeks. And then with districts, we've been working through grants that have gone to a combination of school districts and providers that are working together on different projects to help build district capacity as well. And so it's largely through grants and through partnerships. And I think it's interesting that tutoring has such a strong evidence base at its core, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions in the space. And a lot of those unanswered questions are really important as you think about both what's the price point of tutoring, what's the delivery model of tutoring, and what's the scaling potential of tutoring. And so we're hopeful that through some of these partnerships, we'll be able to answer some of these questions, and that with partnerships with states, we'll be able to build the kind of policy framework over time that will allow tutoring to grow in a way that helps kids.
That's great. That's really wonderful. And Sharon, I want to invite you back into the conversation to tell us about the Innovation Project and its vision for high impact tutoring in North Carolina. What are you and your team hoping to accomplish?
So, the Innovation Project is a organization that seeks to use the collective knowledge, skills, and experience of its members. And it's a collective of superintendents to solve complex problems so that we can ensure that we have equitable access for our students and equitable outcomes. So we are hoping to implement high impact tutoring models across the state that serve students in their specific context. So one of our districts is Wake County, which is the 16th largest in the nation, serving 160,000 students. But we also serve Warren County, which has only 1,800 students and is a rural district consisting of mainly African-American students. We want to employ the very best models, in-person models, virtual models, AI intelligent system models to improve not only the academic outcomes, but more importantly, the life outcomes of the students. But we want to do this by coupling the efforts to reimagine the educator workforce. We don't just want to implement tutoring models. We want to use this to also, or by also redesigning school schedules, providing educators with more flexibility and autonomy over their day and time, how they use time, just redefining educator roles, tying this to new compensation models like the one we have in North Carolina that has yet to be employed. And we want to do this to establish proof of concept so that it can be taken to scale across the state. So that's the goal in this initiative. And we're looking for great partners because it's difficult to do this when you have very rural districts that have been isolated and you don't have people who have done this well. Like, it's still relatively new and very few students in districts in the state and across the country are actually receiving high impact tutoring.
I know why innovation is in the name of your organization. It's truly innovative. It's really exciting. And so I'll invite both of you to sort of tag team this answer. Maybe we'll start with Kevin and then ask Sharon to respond. From both of your vantage points, what levers are available to states to actually enable the conditions we've been talking about here today? And what should the state leaders be doing to make this possible? If possible, again, I would love to hear any specific examples of what this might even look like in practice. So Kevin, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks. And as you might imagine from, my past at a state agency, this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So one thing I think states can do more effectively is tying tutoring to broader goals that they care about. And so as we think about this group that's here today and the focus on grade level reading, I think that's a classic example of an area where states can do a better job of stating explicitly the big goal is the outcome in an academic area, and tutoring is an important way to get leverage against that goal, because I think that both helps you focus your resources in the tutoring space and also then ensures that districts and schools feel like they are pushing against something that's really important. So Ohio and Arkansas are states that recently have gone down the legislative path on science of reading legislation. We'll see sort of how this winds up looking, but they're examples of places where they're stating a big goal for early literacy, and then tutoring is an important point of leverage and means to an end against something bigger. So that's one thing that I think sort of sits on top of everything else. And then some specific state policy areas where I think states have a lot of potential to engage. One, data collection and mandates around data collection. It's very opaque. You've heard some of the folks on the panel talk about, different providers where the uptake is particularly low, for instance. Well, it would be good to know in real time what places are having high levels of uptake and attendance. And, and I don't blame people for the position that we're in right now, because everyone has sort of hustled to try to get resources to kids. But now it'd be good to take a half step back and set up some data collection mandates and processes that allow us to see what's actually happening, and then be able to identify the places that are doing the best job, so that we can lift those up. A second thing is on the contract side. You heard somebody earlier talked about preferred provider lists. I think there's a real opportunity on the state side to identify providers that actually have a track record of success, that have a real research base, and ensure that they get some prioritization, and then to set up state contracting in a way that allows states to actually look for outcomes. So outcomes-based contracting in the procurement process has a huge opportunity to give lift to better outcomes. I don't know how many people saw that New Mexico recently canceled a tutoring contract, a large-scale tutoring contract, but they had written into their contract certain terms around what the uptake needed to be. And when the provider didn't meet those terms, they were able to cancel that contract, which saved them a bunch of money and also saved districts from spinning their wheels in something that didn't have a lot of uptake. And I don't want to keep going and going, but technical assistance for districts is important, and also support for tutoring in the context of interventions and tiered supports, and helping districts understand that there is a way to stop using interventions that don't have an evidence base and instead replace them with tutoring.
Yes,
Thank you.
all of that, Kevin. That's exactly what superintendents who are members of the Innovation Project are saying. They want more guidance and support from the state department, and they want to be able to trust that the State Department is using research and evidence-based practices when they make recommendations about procurement and about high-quality instructional materials. They also want more support around data collection and data analysis. Many of these districts are very small, and as I said, rural, and they don't have data people in their districts, and they have no way of acquiring this personnel. As in this particular state, we receive funding in people, not in dollars, as I received in other states I've worked. So that's a problem for us. I also think the conditions have to be much more flexible with respect to staff, time, and funding, and the districts need more. If we receive that flexibility, the districts have to receive much more guidance around that. You can't just say, okay, now you're a restart school, you have flexibility. We have to understand what that means, how you can use the budgets, how you can integrate the budgets. And I think that will help the districts be much more amenable to employing innovative strategies.
So this question is going to be for everybody, and it's sort of going to be one of those. All right, let's try to do something really hard, which is pick one, right? So we've heard so many important levers that states have available to them to really ensure that effective high impact tutoring can scale. We talked about tutor training, we talked about data, we talked about policy that allows for flexibility. In your opinion, if you had to choose one, what is right now the most important lever a state has to ensure that tutoring can work, high impact tutoring can work at scale? And what advice do you have for the people who are listening to this call on what they can do to ensure that that lever gets used? So I'm going to kick it off and ask Carly to start.
Okay, I refuse to say this is the most important lever because I'm really excited. I reserve the right to change my answer to other people's answer. But I will kick it off, I think, because it's been top of mind for me, talking about the importance and challenge of staffing high impact tutoring programs. One huge barrier we're seeing on the ground is that schools just don't have the bodies, like the tutors, to serve the number of students they'd like to serve in high impact tutoring programs. And the way schools are currently staffed, it's not conducive to students receiving small group personalized instruction. So districts really need support. And I think the state can support districts on the staffing front. This is getting back to what Kevin and I talked about before, but many districts will need to partner with tutoring providers, and states can do some of that legwork for them to provide the list of vetted providers with those proven programs, or with those programs that have the elements of high impact tutoring. So it's just one less thing that district officials need to really concern themselves with. Same with background checks. Maybe these providers also have a fast track for background checks. That's delayed tutoring. We've seen background checks delay tutorings for months in certain districts, which is really frustrating. I also mentioned, that states can invest in creating tutoring corps. And so the National Partnership for Student Success, or NPSS, which was mentioned before, is a national organization that is supporting organizations to recruit, screen, train, support, and engage, over 250,000 caring adults to serve as tutors and other mentors. And I think states can really lean on that, and even actually can encourage your state to lean on sort of these like federally available resources that are out there trying to help. And finally, investing in university tutoring programs has the potential to provide a sustainable supply of tutors. And I will just one important note: you really should not I don't think we should be relying on volunteer tutors in many of these cases, particularly college students. You do need to pay college students to do this important work. And also importantly, that's what they respond to. We conducted a study to understand what motivates college students to apply to be tutors, and messages that highlighted the monetary compensation were 200% more effective at recruiting those tutors. And so and I'll stop after this, but I think by investing in the staffing of tutoring programs or providers, there's a real opportunity for tutoring to be a pipeline into the teaching profession, which AJ mentioned before, because becoming a tutor is a much lower barrier than enrolling in a teacher prep program. So when states support universities and tutoring corps and other mechanisms for increasing the supply of tutors, they may also be getting people interested in education or a teaching career who may not have otherwise been exposed to it. So that's, I think, a lever that states can push on that I'm excited about.
Phenomenal. Kevin.
So I would say uptake in attendance tracking. And in my mind, I'm sort of increasingly obsessed with this particular point. We've got evidence that shows lots of different kinds of people can be effective tutors. We have emerging evidence that tutoring can be delivered in different ways. We have no evidence that suggests that tutoring works if you don't show up. So you got to show up, and you have to show up regularly. That's one of the core tenets that NSSA has done a great job of sort of hammering to people. There's a sort of regularity that matters. And then some of the providers that we've worked with have their own internal data that shows that when kids are there 75% of the time that they're supposed to be or more, they do much better than when they are there less frequently than that. And this seems intuitive, and yet we're not tracking this in a consistent way. We're not mandating that people track it in a consistent way. There's information system challenges that providers will talk about and states and districts will talk about. And so we've got to fix some of those interfaces. But I think states have to mandate that we are going to track this, and we are going to report on it, and we are going to identify the places that do it well, and we're going to hold them up, and we're going to identify the places that are not doing it well, and we're going to try to intervene and support them. But just as regular attendance, we learned 20 years ago through significant research that chronic absenteeism in regular school was a major driver of outcomes. We have to apply that same logic to tutoring, and we have to apply some of the mandates around data tracking, because I think that's just like base camp for this whole thing.
Yeah. And Kevin, could you spend maybe 30 seconds talking about how, whether or not you see this as sort of it's a tool in this sense, right? Like what I don't think you're proposing is that this becomes sort of another data thing that we track and sort of slap people over the wrist with if they get up. What I'm hearing you say is to the point we talked about before, it's a place for us to learn about what works and what doesn't and intervene when we need it, right?
Correct. I think as a starting point, you mandate the collection, and then you move to doing some level of reporting so that people can see what's happening. And then you identify the places that are doing it really well, and you help them help their peers, and you elevate those practices. And so it's sort of a multi-step place. Now, I could imagine that years from now, you get to a point where there is something that is more mandatory as we sort of learn what works. But I think we've got some steps to take. But as sort of like base camp, like let's just collect the data and make sure people know.
That's great. AJ, your turn. What's the lever that we should prioritize pulling?
Yeah, I just want to underscore everything that Carly and Kevin said. I mean, to implement what they're doing, you have to, I think states should demand or ask for the feds to steer capacity building funds to strengthen their data capacity, and also to steer funding for additional R&D. High impact tutoring is an area worthy of additional exploration. And so there should be additional funding for research. I'm saying that as a general catch-all. It doesn't all have to be RCTs. They can look at their policies around time and learning. They can look at their policies around leveraging work study funding, as Carly was alluding to. They can look at their policies really around to make high impact tutoring scalable around granting the use of effective live online tutoring. So live online tutoring, I think, is crucial for the expansion of scale of high impact tutoring. And there's the way in which you can implement live online tutoring that abide by the key tenets that Carly's talked about that leads to really promising outcomes. So there's emerging evidence around that, including of Saga-led programs that I think are very exciting. And this is particularly important for districts serving students in rural communities or suburban communities. They don't oftentimes have access to the same kind of colleges or university ecosystem as like a Chicago public schools would have. And so the other thing I think is really exciting in the context of scale is that language learning models, AI and technology is going to be the next way we think about scaling high impact tutoring. There's so many things we're doing at Saga exploring this, using adaptive learning technology to enhance student learning, but also using artificial intelligence for coaching and feedback. We're working alongside, we receive funding from the National Science Foundation and others, and working alongside the UC Boulder School of Mines, where we're training an artificial intelligence that can provide feedback just as effectively as an expert observer on a set of instructional strategies. Now, I know that sounds like science fiction, but that's the universe we're in now. Like that kind of technology exists, and we're actively piloting that technology right now at Saga Education, and we're really excited about rolling that out in the future. So I think from a state leader's perspective, thinking about how can we work alongside our university partners and others in the space to think about the intersection between human-led and technology augmented personalization.
Yeah, that's awesome. Again, real innovative leadership on this panel. I love it. And last, Sharon, what about you? What's the number one lever that you'd like state leaders to pull right now?
I think just looking at funding, and I think there are pots of money there, and just changing some of the policies. So in North Carolina, there's a class size reduction law. When I was superintendent, I had at least one class size reduction teacher at every grade level, K-3, in all 69 elementary schools. That's 276 teachers. When you think about that, if I could have used those as tutors, or even split those and use them as retirees, that's 552 potential tutors. Or use that funding for North Carolina Education Corps, Tutoring Corps that could help us find tutors. I think across the state, that's tens of millions of dollars that could be used more effectively. I also think the state could think about reducing the tuition to four-year colleges for students that will dedicate some part of their time to tutoring in our K-12 system. I think that would be very valuable. We're also providing in many of our community colleges free tuition already, but there is no obligation to do anything but attend school. And I think service is something we should ask for, and that could include tutoring. The other thing that's not really a problem in North Carolina, but it is in some other states, is looking at licensure. I think we have to reconsider that whole notion that you must be a certified teacher to tutor. There are many people who can tutor and tutor students very effectively that do not need to be certified.
So one of the things I love about this conversation is just getting a much more complete picture of all of the things it takes to really make this work. And when what you think of sometimes is just an adult and a student talking about math for 30 minutes in a day, and it's really so many of these different things really have to come together for it to really take off and be effective for all folks. Before we turn to Q&A, there's certainly one very important question that I know is top of mind for lots of folks, which is around funding this. So particularly how we're going to afford high impact tutoring after ESSER funding runs out. Sharon, you did a great job teeing us up with this last comment you made about funding flexibility. So I'll turn back to you and just say, what else do you think states should be doing right now to ensure tutoring remains viable 2, 3, even 5 years down the line from a funding perspective?
Again, I just think that many districts don't know how to use the funding in a flexible way. So the support for districts in teaching superintendents, CFOs, because the superintendents listen to the CFOs about how they can more effectively and innovatively use federal funding, I think would be helpful. How Restart districts could use in North Carolina could use their funding, how to use school improvement grants more effectively would be extraordinarily helpful to districts. We need to hear from our state departments, and we need to trust that the information they are giving us is reliable and useful. And I think for many of us, we think that there is no funding out there. We do have some funding, but we don't understand the flexibilities around the funding.
That's great. I think that goes to a point that AJ made earlier on implementation support. So AJ, I'll kick it to you and ask you the same question. What do you think states should be doing right now to ensure tutoring remains viable 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 years out?
I think there's a common misconception that high impact tutoring is not sustainable. I mean, the reality is it makes good business sense for districts to invest in an evidence-based model at a high leverage point as insurance to keep students on track for graduation. So most district funding is tied to per pupil enrollment, and Algebra 1 is widely known to be a gatekeeper for a high school diploma. And so if a student can pass his or her 9th grade Algebra 1 class, they're 4 times more likely to earn a high school diploma. So when high impact tutoring is done well, especially through Saga, there's as much as a 63% reduction in math class failure rates when it's done well, and districts can do this well. So with that said, if you're investing in high impact tutoring, you're creating the conditions where students are more likely to persist in school. So let's say your tutoring program costs $1,500 per student, and a student who would have otherwise dropped out persisted in school. Over the course of 3 years, your return on investment is 10 to 30 fold, depending on your state's per pupil model. So for me, it makes good on revenue the district would have otherwise lost. And so for me, this is a logical, just on a purely financial perspective, logical investment for district leaders to make.
That's great. Kevin, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, those are great. I mean, I put a pin in what Sharon said about LEAs need to hear from SEAs. And so we need to make it easier for the average district to implement. So that means both support from the state in understanding what are different ways that you can fund it, and also support on implementation. Even the highest performing districts are struggling to get to serving 10% of their kids right now. And we need to figure out how to make this easier. And part of making it easier is helping districts understand how to fund it. I would also say, I know you're asking about states, but on the provider side, we have to figure out how to drive down the cost as well, because even though I think it's true what AJ said, that this is a great investment, even at a higher price point, I think as a practical matter, just having worked with a lot of district CFOs over time and budget directors over time, if the price point feels too high, it will be hard to get districts in tighter budget times to implement it. So we got to figure out how to get the price point down. And I think one big thing, of course, states can do is dedicated funding and building it into their funding formulas. And I think we're going to start to see more districts bake it into their funding formulas over the next few years.
Excellent. And Carly, last word before we open up to Q&A. What advice do you have about how we can ensure that high impact tutoring remains sustainable into the future?
Yes, in addition to everything my fellow panelists have said, because I totally agree with everything they said. And I will also say, as the researcher in the group, I've been pleasantly surprised how often everyone else has been talking about the importance of collecting data and research, but I'll just double down on this a little bit. I'm really concerned that we're at a point where lots of money is being invested into a lot of different efforts. And in the end, we won't know whether anything worked because we didn't collect the right data or design the program so we can pinpoint whether it worked or not. And if we're talking about, how can we encourage these investments into tutoring? Well, showing they work is a really great way to encourage investments into tutoring. So I think that states can and need to create the infrastructure and accountability for data collection and measurement. And then to Dr. Contreras' point from before, connect districts with resources to analyze their data in a rigorous way, so we can understand what types of tutoring programs are leading to student learning gains and which are not, and identify the elements of high impact tutoring that are more or less important, and where maybe we can cut costs. And so, yes, I think that focusing on data measurement and research is an opportunity to pave the way to continued investments in high impact tutoring and other educational interventions going forward.
Great. I want to turn now to Q&A from our audience, but really, I'll start by saying thank you to all our panelists again for sharing such important insight into what we know and what we need to continue to learn about what it will take to scale effective high impact tutoring for all students. So we have a number of questions in the Q&A box, and encourage any of our audience, if you have additional questions, please do put those into the Q&A tab on your Zoom function. But I want to start with a question from John, which is about how tutoring may be different for younger students and older students. And particularly Kevin and AJ, I think you both spoke to the need for states to sort of maybe prioritize some of those learning outcomes, either third grade reading or middle school math. And so I'll start by Carly, actually, to say, what does NSSA know, or what can the NSSA's research and the research base tell us about what may or may not be different between early grades and later grades tutoring?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons of focusing on this sort of, late middle school, early high school math, and then early literacy is because there's the most evidence that the tutoring in those grades and those subjects can really accelerate student learning. And so if we're talking about like putting our money where we might get the biggest bang for our buck, there's evidence that it can work. I do think there are a lot of the elements, stay the same, but I do think there are some key differences. There was a comment, I think I saw a question about the training, and I do think it's harder to source tutors for Algebra 1 than it is to teach them how to read, because if you yourself can't add fractions, then it's going to be really hard to identify when a student's stuck in algebra because they don't know how to add fractions. So I do think that the sourcing and the training of the tutors is different, although a lot of like the relationship and engagement aspects are remarkably similar. I will note one thing on the early literacy side. We have a new program that we help to evaluate, Chapter 1 in Broward County, and we found they have a part-time tutor embedded in the classroom for like daily, and they pull out kindergarten and first grade students for short bursts of instruction, so like 5 to 10 minutes of instruction. And so that actually, our original elements of high impact tutoring, we were saying you need at least, 20, 30, 45 minutes in a session to be effective. But because they're really leveraging the fact that kindergartners and first graders might have shorter attention spans, and there might be this in-person because they're in the classroom and have the ability to be responsive to students' needs in the moment, they can actually give them the short burst of instruction and then pull them out again tomorrow and give a similar short burst. And so I think as this research evolves and we'll learn more, we'll see maybe how those differ. But overall, I think a lot of the elements are the same.
Any of our other panelists have anything to add to that?
Just real quick, I think that's great. And I was going to cite the short bursts as well. It does give me pause on states being overly prescriptive on the elements of high impact tutoring. We know a lot through research, and yet you could imagine, for instance, if a state had a mandate that high impact tutoring only counts if it's like 30 minutes multiple times a week. But actually, it turns out that for K2 reading, you can get this done in 11-minute sessions, and we've got evidence that it works. You don't want to mandate that out of existence. And so I do think, one of the tricks of this, and it's very hard, you want to herd people in a direction where they're doing their work based on the evidence, but you're not foreclosing things that you might learn through other research about other kinds of things, including things like AJ was starting to allude to in the AI space.
That's great. So we have a question from the audience around buy-in, right? And so even though we know that I think some estimates put 40% of schools now are offering some version of high impact tutoring, that maybe not be present in all schools, and certainly not all schools that need it. And I'm curious, and Sharon, let's start with you. What advice do you have for the folks on this call about how they can generate excitement and buy-in for bringing high impact tutoring to their states or their communities?
Well, I think the first thing we have to realize is when our children need help, the first thing we do is get a tutor. Like, so if it's good for us, it's good for all children. And we also have to make the research much more understandable and relatable to the community. When I talk about research, I try not to be so erudite where the community doesn't want to hear it or says the age-old statement, oh, I can make numbers say anything. And I think they get kind of tired of hearing that. And they don't want this to be just the next new thing that's going to come and go. They really want to know this is going to help their children, their biological children, their personal children, and also the children within their community, their school districts. And so we have to make sure that we are explaining that and we're sharing the wins, every small win. And I think Guilford County has done an extraordinary job with that, with saying we tutored X number of children this week. And they share that every week, just saying we tutored them. And they also share the students who were tutored graduated at this rate as opposed to the students who were not tutored. They just do a phenomenal job with that, and I can't shout them out enough. And so many of our colleagues across the country, Indianapolis Public Schools, Superintendent Alicia Johnson and her team are doing a wonderful job with that. I just think we have to just make the data very clear and compelling, and make sure the community understands that they are getting a great return on their investment and that their children are doing better as a result of this initiative.
I love that. I love that. And AJ, I want to invite you in to add to this here, knowing that you've worked with so many districts and so many states and so many communities across the country. What have you seen work in your experience in terms of creating buy-in and excitement for high impact tutoring?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that it's okay if a school or district doesn't want to do this. And so I think if you want it to be effective, it's not force people to do it, because that's just it'll lead to failure right out of the gate. So if you want to generate excitement around high impact tutoring, just lean into those early adopters, provide them with the resources and guidance and support they need. And as Sharon mentioned, share that data with the community, but also let those principals talk to their peers about what they're learning. And so that's how you can get buy-in, is by peers championing this type of work. And so I think that's how you generate excitement, is just focus on those early adopters, and the results and their learnings will speak for themselves. You don't have to be too salesy about it.
So some other interest from folks from the audience is around so it looks like we have a number of tutoring providers out there who are interested in figuring out how they can raise their own profile, and particularly potentially be vetted by NSSA or Accelerate, or get in front of some of these other organizations that are really trying to bring some standards of quality to the work. What advice do, maybe Carly, we'll start with you. What would you say to some of these tutoring providers that want to work with states to address some of these conditions? How would you, what would you tell them about how to get on the NSSA's approved list, for instance?
So at NSSA, we do have a tutoring database, and you can go to the website. I can drop the link in after, and just join the tutoring database if you're a tutoring provider. We also have our tutor quality improvement system, and this actual TQIS. And so tutoring providers can actually go through an assessment and be sort of like, we have validated assessments, and sort of like match yourself up against the elements of high impact tutoring to see where where you're meeting it, areas for growth. And so I think those are like the right, particularly because now many states are using this language, like you're using the right lingo to be talking to people here. And I think that the other piece is like collect the data to show evidence that your program works, to get on a vetted tutoring provider list. The best bet is to have pretty strong evidence that your program works. And so that doesn't always have to be an RCT, but you can, but you need to make sure that you're actually collecting the data and looking at it, and being able to show at least some evidence of promise, I think, to get your foot in the door and your name out there.
Great. Excellent. We have one question here that about charter schools, and so rather than this conversation is really focused at the state level, of course, but we know that many states have a diverse set of school options for families, and I'm curious if any of the work that if any of you can speak to the work of how high impact tutoring may look different, or the conditions that we talked about may sort of show up differently in charter schools versus more traditional public schools.
I can talk a little bit about that. First of all, we've got some grants to intermediary organizations that are working directly with charter schools. So like New Schools New Orleans, Commit Partnership in Dallas is working with districts and charters. And so one thing is There's a capacity challenge sometimes, especially for the sort of schools that are just a onesie or a twosie as opposed to a big CMO. So they may not have the central infrastructure. And so I think it can mean that accessing the kinds of like shared services that a district like Guilford might be able to build are harder, and it may require some external help. Now, on the plus side, I would also say charter schools sometimes can just move pretty quickly to build their own thing. So I went and visited a school here in Tennessee that it's on the priority list every year for being in the bottom 5% of results. And they just went and stood up their own program. Now they took state money. So Tennessee has dedicated state money, and they took all the components from NSSA and implemented it at their school. They went out and they advertised, they picked their own price point for hiring, they hired tutors, they dedicated their own staff member to oversee it, and their growth has been kind of extraordinary in math. And it was all just stood up really quickly because they can do that, because they just have the ability to move more quickly. So I would say on the sort of like build your own program, a school can move quickly. On the sort of network work, one of the challenges is they're not a district, so they don't have the big infrastructure, and they sometimes need to be able to tap into something.
Excellent. Okay, so we are just about wrapping up here, and I think the team from the campaign will be launching a survey in a bit that allow you to the audience to provide feedback on the call. So please take the survey before you log off. The campaign takes the poll results very seriously, so please do reply to the survey that you see on your screen now. I think maybe one last question, or if we have time, maybe two more. But there's still a question I think coming up around the talent pool of available tutors. So we've heard a couple of different perspectives on who should be or who can be. Wonder like if there are anything else that hasn't been said about what states could do to ensure that more adults or more maybe even peers, near peers to students who have been trained are available to participate in some of these high impact tutoring programs. What haven't we talked about today that would help this audience really see what could be done to ensure that we have enough tutors to meet the need right now?
I think for me, what's at least for Saga's work, none of the tutors we have are professional educators. And so what's really exciting about that is that the threshold to be an effective tutor is different from the threshold to be an effective teacher. And so the pool of people who are qualified to do this effectively is much larger. So if you have the right systems in place for training, high quality content and curriculum, ongoing PD, these rookie educators can have a pretty significant impact on academic performance of students, especially if it's aligned with classroom instruction and supports classroom teachers. So I think that's what's really refreshing about the opportunity here. So, recent college graduates, it could be retirees even. And so there's lots of interesting talent pools we can explore of people who can be great tutors.
Phenomenal.
Pete, the only thing I'd add on that, totally agree with all that. I think the more we can improve at the state level, district and school access to high quality curriculum for tutoring, whether it's via providers or other means, the more directive the curriculum is and the more user-friendly the curriculum is, the wider you can expand the pool of people who might be able to use it and deliver tutoring, because then you're not asking the tutor to come in and sort of invent a secret sauce themselves. And so there's this tie-in, I think, to the content and what's being delivered.
That's great. I think if I remember correctly from the slides that Carly shared at the beginning, that is one of the important elements of high impact tutoring, is having that high quality curriculum in place.
Yeah, and I would say, in addition to having that curriculum, also making sure that those who are not from the field of education are assured that there will be some support and training. Many people say to me, I can't do that. They really feel they can't do it until they get in there and do it. But I think if they feel there's some structured program that helps them to come into the tutoring space, and they won't be just left out there where they just walk in and they're working with teenagers when they've never worked with teenagers, or working with elementary kids, 8-year-olds, when they've never worked with them before. I think that they would feel much more confident about becoming tutors, and they'll say, oh, I can do that. And then one other small thing, I do think that at state departments and school districts, you have lots of educators who are trying to come up with public relations strategies and PR strategies around recruitment. And I think that there has to be some funding set aside for statewide PR campaigns to reach people who are not educators. And that includes focus groups. Like, what appeals to someone at, Apple, IBM, in the faith community to come into a school? Like, I think I know, but I'm a teacher at heart. But what appeals to, a computer scientist to come in and tutor 3 times a week? I think we need to set aside some funding to allow PR folks to assist us with the recruitment of tutors who are non-educators.
Great. Sharon, if you don't mind, before you go back on mute, I'd love a question for you too. Is I'm getting some question in the chat about how community partners can support the high impact tutoring in schools. You just mentioned the need to potentially recruit from those community partners to be the tutors we have. I'm wondering if there are other ways in which you and the different superintendents of the Innovation Project are hoping that your community partners support their efforts around high impact tutoring. And what advice do you have to folks on the call who also want to support that work in their communities?
Yeah, so we would love for, as I just said, more people to feel confident about their own education and their ability to support students. Now, some of them, we'll have to provide you with some training to hone up on your 5th grade math skills. Not that you don't know it, but some things you just have to have a quick review. And in some districts, like Guilford County, we actually help you go through modules. And so as the lessons come up, we prepare you for those, and you go through them. And then you go and work with the students. And I think that we can do a better job so tutors aren't frustrated and feel like it's just undoable. So in the Innovation Project, we're really hopeful about working with community partners. And in some of the rural districts where they don't have lots of community agencies, like I've been to districts where there's not a YMCA, there's not the Boys and Girls Club. They want to partner virtually with larger communities to work with our students. And so we're looking forward to building these partnerships and working with the districts on how do you, lead in the eastern part of the state, but build a relationship with the Boys and Girls Club on the western part, in the western part of the state. And that takes training as well. So this is going to be a heavy lift, but we are optimistic that it can be done, and we can provide every single student that needs support with the support that he or she needs.
I think that is an excellent place to wrap up this conversation, because I think that's what motivates all of us on this call, which is how do we ensure that every student gets the support that they need to excel. And so I want to personally thank the campaign for hosting this conversation, and all of you in the audience for joining us in this important learning opportunity. And Sharon, AJ, Kevin, Carly, thank you for sharing your expertise and experience with us. It's been such a pleasure to learn from you all today. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Emily.
I mean, amazing discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you to our awesome presenters for all of the questions that you answered in the Q&A box. And if we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. I feel like we did kind of everything that was asked. I feel like we covered in one way or another. So hopefully everybody feels like their questions were responded to. So we just want to say thank you again to all of you. And please, everyone, there is a part 2 with Overdeck. Focused on tutoring next week that is going to dig into local supports. So please, we posted the registration information in the chat and our other upcoming sessions. So yes, we have 2 sessions next week, a crucible of practice, and then the part 2 of this. And then on the 18th, a funder to funder conversation focused on kindergarten. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And then also we want to remind you one more time to please complete the What's Working exchange survey. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And hopefully we'll see you all next week. And thank you so much to our awesome speakers.